A human skeleton should not be found sitting in a church pew. Two human skeletons, sitting side by side as if patiently waiting for a sermon that would never come, is a scene of profound and silent horror. For 11 years, sisters Sarah and Emily Carter were just a memory, a cold case file, two faces on a missing poster that had faded in the sun. Then, on a crisp autumn afternoon, they were found, not in a shallow grave or lost to the elements, but carefully, deliberately placed within the decaying walls of the abandoned St. Giles Chapel, deep in the heart of Widow's Peak Forest. Sarah Carter was 22, the sensible older sister, the one who always packed extra water and a first aid kit. Her sister, Emily, was 19, filled with a restless energy that complemented Sarah's quiet composure. They were ordinary young women, sharing a small apartment while attending the local community college, their lives a familiar rhythm of classes, part-time jobs, and weekend plans. They were not expert survivalists or thrill-seeking adventurers. They were simply two sisters who loved the quiet majesty of the woods and planned a simple overnight hike to see the fall colors from the summit of Widow's Peak. The mystery of their disappearance was a stark and brutal paradox. It was a story that began with the mundane joy of a planned excursion into nature, a simple trip along a well-documented portion of the Appalachian Trail. It ended over a decade later, with a discovery so bizarre, so chillingly theatrical, that it defied all logical explanation. How did two young women vanish from a popular trail on a clear day, and why would their remains reappear 11 years later? Staged like a ghostly congregation in a place forgotten by time? The plan was unremarkable, the kind of weekend trip thousands of people make every year without incident. It was the second weekend of October 2014. The air was cool, the leaves were turning shades of fire, and the forecast promised clear skies. Sarah and Emily had planned a 2-day loop, a 15-mile hike that was considered moderate in difficulty. They would camp overnight at a designated shelter near the peak and hike back down the following day. It was a well-worn path, a familiar escape from the pressures of their daily lives. Their preparations were careful, but not excessive. They packed a small tent, sleeping bags, enough food for 2 days, and water purification tablets. Sarah, ever the planner, had left a copy of their intended route on the kitchen counter of their apartment for their parents. The sisters were close with their family, and this kind of communication was routine. There was no sense of foreboding, no hint of the tragedy that was about to unfold. It was, in every respect, a perfectly normal beginning to what should have been an uneventful weekend. The last time their parents heard from them was on Saturday morning, just before 10. Emily sent a text message to their mother, a photograph of the two of them smiling broadly at the trailhead sign for Widow's Peak. The message that accompanied it was simple and cheerful. Emily told her mom they were about to head out and would call her when they were back in cell range on Sunday evening. It was the last message anyone would ever receive. That final image of two bright, hopeful faces on the precipice of their journey would become the haunting emblem of the entire case. Widow's Peak Forest was a vast expanse of rugged, unforgiving wilderness. It covered nearly 80,000 acres of dense woods, steep ravines, and rocky outcrops. While the main trails were well maintained, the forest itself was a labyrinth where one could easily become disoriented just a few hundred feet off the path. The forest was ancient, indifferent to human concerns. It was a place that could swallow secrets whole, where the rustling of leaves and the snapping of twigs could mask any sound, and where the deep shadows of the old-growth trees could conceal anything or anyone from view. This sprawling, silent wilderness was the last place Sarah and Emily were ever seen alive. Sunday evening arrived, and the expected call from the sisters never came. Their parents, Carol and David Carter, initially tried to suppress their growing anxiety. They reasoned that the girls might have been delayed on the trail, or perhaps their phone batteries had died. But as the hours stretched into the late evening, and then bled into the early morning of Monday, logic gave way to a cold, creeping dread. By sunrise on Monday, the Carters knew something was terribly wrong. They contacted the local sheriff's department and officially reported their daughters missing. The search operation began almost immediately and quickly escalated into one of the largest in the state's history. The sisters' blue sedan was located in the trailhead parking lot, exactly where they had left it. Inside, everything appeared normal. A few empty water bottles, a road map in the glove compartment. Nothing to suggest a struggle or a frantic departure. The discovery of the car confirmed their starting point, and search and rescue teams, composed of county sheriffs, state police, and hundreds of civilian volunteers, began to comb the designated hiking trail. They moved in grid patterns, their shouts echoing through the quiet woods, but the forest offered no reply. Helicopters equipped with forward-looking infrared cameras scoured the terrain from above, but the dense autumn canopy rendered the technology largely ineffective. K-9 units were brought in, yet the dogs seemed unable to pick up a definitive scent beyond the first few hundred yards of the trail. The scale of the operation was immense, a testament to the community's desperation, but the forest was larger. The search was a grueling, frustrating effort against an indifferent landscape that seemed determined to hold its secrets. Each passing day without a clue diminished the hope that had fueled the initial efforts. Investigators explored every plausible theory. The initial assumption was that the sisters had simply gotten lost. Perhaps they had wandered off the trail, become disoriented, and succumbed to the elements. Yet, as the search area expanded and yielded nothing, not a footprint, not a dropped water bottle, not a single scrap of clothing, this theory began to seem less likely. Sarah was known for her meticulous planning, and it was considered out of character for her to stray so far from a marked path without a compelling reason. The possibility that they had run away was also considered, a standard procedure in any missing persons case involving young adults. Detectives checked their bank accounts, credit cards, and social media activity. There was nothing. Their accounts remained untouched, their digital lives frozen at the moment they stepped onto the trail. It was clear they had not planned to leave. The more sinister theory, that of foul play, began to loom over the investigation, but without any evidence, it remained a grim speculation, a dark whisper among the search teams. After 2 exhaustive weeks, the official large-scale search was called off. The resources were depleted, and the statistical probability of finding the sisters alive had dwindled to nearly 0. The change in status from a rescue to a recovery mission was a devastating blow to the Carter family. Volunteers continued to organize smaller weekend searches for months, their hope warring with the grim reality, but they found nothing. The forest remained silent. The posters with Sarah and Emily's smiling faces began to weather and peel, their images fading like the hope of ever finding them. For 11 years, the case of the Carter sisters existed in a state of suspended animation. It became a piece of local folklore, a cautionary tale told to hikers about the dangers of Widow's Peak Forest. The file sat on a detective's desk, gathering dust, a cold case with no leads, no suspects, and no answers. For their family, it was a wound that would not close, a perpetual state of not knowing. That was its own unique form of torture. 11 years of silence passed, a silence so profound and complete that it felt permanent. Then, on October 14th, 2025, almost 11 years to the day since the sisters vanished, that silence was shattered. The discovery was not made by law enforcement or a determined investigator, but by 2 teenagers engaging in the modern hobby of urban exploration. Armed with smartphones and a desire for social media content, they had decided to explore the ruins of St. Giles Chapel, a pre-Civil War structure deep within the forest that had been abandoned for over a century. The chapel was notoriously difficult to find, accessible only by a series of overgrown, unmarked trails, a local legend that most people avoided. The teenagers pushed open the heavy, rotting oak doors, stepping from the bright afternoon sun into the gloomy, dust-choked interior. Light filtered weakly through the grimy, broken stained glass windows, illuminating a scene of total decay. Pews were overturned, the floor was littered with fallen plaster, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and rot. As their eyes adjusted, they saw it. In the very front pew, sitting upright, were 2 skeletons, clad in the tattered, moldering remains of hiking gear. They were positioned side by side, their skeletal hands resting in their laps, their eyeless sockets facing the crumbling altar. The scene was not one of natural death. It was a tableau, a deliberately arranged spectacle of horror. There were no signs of animal scavenging, which was highly unusual for remains left in the wilderness for any length of time. The bones were bleached white and largely intact, suggesting they had been protected from the elements for a significant period before being placed in the chapel. The teenagers, initially frozen in disbelief and terror, scrambled out of the church, and once they found a signal, made a frantic call to 911. The cold case of Sarah and Emily Carter was suddenly, horrifically active again. The discovery of the remains in such a bizarre and unnatural state immediately reclassified the case. This was no longer a missing persons investigation. It was a homicide. The county medical examiner, working with a team of forensic anthropologists, confirmed the identities through dental records. The remains belonged to Sarah and Emily Carter. The subsequent forensic examination of the skeletons provided the first real breakthrough in the case in over a decade. It was a detail that could only be found on the delicate bones of the throat. Both skeletons showed clean, bilateral fractures of the hyoid bone, a small U-shaped bone in the neck that is notoriously difficult to break. Such fractures are exceedingly rare in accidental deaths or falls. They are, however, a classic and telltale indicator of manual strangulation. The finding was conclusive. Sarah and Emily Carter had not gotten lost. They had not succumbed to the elements. They were murdered. This clinical, irrefutable fact transformed the investigation, pointing it away from the indifferent cruelty of nature and toward the calculated cruelty of a human predator. With the confirmation of a double homicide, detectives reopened the old case files, viewing every piece of information through this new, violent lens. Their focus immediately shifted to the location of the discovery. The abandoned chapel was on private land, part of a larger, multi-hundred-acre parcel that bordered the state forest. Investigators began meticulously reviewing property records from 2014, cross-referencing them with old witness statements and police logs from the time of the initial search. They were looking for anyone who lived in the area, anyone who might have had a reason to be near that isolated, forgotten church. A single name began to surface from the dusty archives: Silas Croft. In 2014, Croft was a man in his late 60s who owned the sprawling, dilapidated property on which the chapel stood. His name had appeared in several minor police reports from that year, all involving complaints he had made about hikers straying from the official trail and trespassing onto his land. He had been briefly interviewed during the initial search for the sisters, but he had provided a vague alibi and was dismissed by the overwhelmed investigators as a cantankerous but harmless local eccentric. Now, his proximity to the discovery site and his documented hostility toward hikers made him a person of interest. He was the prime suspect. Detectives learned that Silas Croft still lived on the same property, now even more reclusive and isolated than he had been a decade prior. They obtained a search warrant for his house and the surrounding land. On a cold, gray morning, a convoy of law enforcement vehicles rolled down the long, unpaved driveway leading to his home. The property was a portrait of neglect. The house was a ramshackle structure with peeling paint and boarded-up windows, surrounded by a yard filled with rusting farm equipment and overgrown weeds. It was a place that felt frozen in time, cut off from the outside world. Silas, now frail and in his late 70s, offered no resistance as the officers entered his home. The interior was dark and cluttered, filled with stacks of old newspapers and junk, the air heavy with the scent of dust and decay. As the search team methodically worked their way through the squalor, one detective opened an old wooden footlocker at the end of Silas's bed. Inside, beneath a layer of moth-eaten blankets, was a small, unassuming digital camera. It was weathered and caked with dirt, but it was unmistakably the model that had been listed in the original missing persons report for Emily Carter. The discovery of the camera was the turning point. Forensic technicians were able to recover the memory card. The final pictures stored on it painted a terrifying sequence of events. The first few images were what one would expect: beautiful shots of the autumn foliage, a selfie of the two sisters smiling on the trail. But the last 3 photos were different. They were chaotic, blurry images of the forest floor, taken in rapid succession, as if the camera had been dropped while still on. The very last image was a dark, indistinct shape, a fleeting glimpse of a figure looming over the lens before the recording stopped forever. It was the irrefutable piece of trophy evidence that linked Silas Croft directly to the victims. Faced with the camera, Silas Croft's decades of silence finally broke. In the sterile environment of the police interrogation room, he began to talk, his confession delivered in a cold, detached monotone, utterly devoid of remorse. His motive, when it was finally revealed, was not born of some grand evil, but of a petty, paranoid, and pathetic rage. He told the investigators that on that Saturday afternoon he had been patrolling the edge of his property when he saw Sarah and Emily. They had taken a wrong turn at an unmarked fork in the trail and had unknowingly wandered onto his land. His long, festering resentment of trespassers, coupled with a deep-seated paranoia that outsiders were there to spy on him or steal from him, ignited into a confrontation. He claimed he had shouted at them to leave, but they had seemed confused, perhaps frightened by his sudden, aggressive appearance. In his twisted perception, their hesitation was defiance. He flew into an uncontrollable rage, attacking the 2 unarmed women. The crime itself was brutal and quick. Afterward, he dragged their bodies into an old root cellar on his property, where they remained hidden for years. He explained that the guilt, or perhaps the fear of discovery, had gnawed at him. In a final, bizarre act, he had moved their skeletal remains to the abandoned chapel a few years prior, arranging them on the pew. It was not an act of remorse, but a twisted attempt to put the matter to rest in his own mind, to place them somewhere he considered final. Silas Croft was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. During the trial, the prosecution presented the camera, the forensic evidence of strangulation, and his own chilling, detailed confession. The defense attempted to argue diminished capacity due to his age and isolation, but the jury saw only the calculated cruelty of his actions. He was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences in prison, with no possibility of parole. The legal system had delivered its verdict, providing a definitive, albeit deeply unsatisfying, conclusion to the case. The story of Sarah and Emily Carter is a somber reflection on the terrifying randomness of violence. They were not reckless. They were not unprepared. They were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, their innocent journey intersecting for a fatal moment with a hidden evil that festered just beyond the edge of the civilized world. Their tragedy serves as a haunting reminder that the greatest dangers are often not the vast, impersonal forces of nature, but the dark, inexplicable impulses that can reside within a human heart. For 11 years, they were missing, and now, finally found, their story concludes not with peace, but with the chilling knowledge of how fragile the line is between an ordinary day and an incomprehensible nightmare.